In December 2001, in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Durham, North Carolina, a 911 dispatcher received a panicked call. A man was practically screaming into the phone. He said his wife had fallen down the stairs and was dying. The recording reveals heavy breathing, hysteria, and repeated references to blood. The man was Michael Peterson. When police arrived at the house, they encountered a scene that many officers later called one of the most horrific of their careers. 48-year-old Kathleen Peterson was lying on the floor. There was a huge amount of blood all around. It was on the walls, the steps, the floor, even the doors. Michael stood nearby and repeated the same thing. It was an accident. But already that night, some investigators began to have doubts, because the scene seemed too strange for a simple fall down the stairs. No one realized that this case would become one of the most talked about criminal investigations in America. A story featuring secret relationships, a hidden sex life, the mysterious death of another woman, and the feeling that everything that was happening had happened before. To understand how Michael Peterson found himself at the center of this nightmare, we need to go back to the very beginning. Michael Peterson was born in the United States in 1943, and from his youth gave the impression of someone who always wanted to be special. Smart, charismatic, and confident, he had a way of speaking that quickly drew people's trust. He later attended university and then found himself in the army during the Vietnam War. Michael loved to talk about his military experiences and gradually built an image of himself as a veteran who had survived difficult events. He spoke about trauma, dangerous situations, and his service so convincingly that many perceived him as almost a hero. After the army, he began writing books, and to many's surprise, he achieved success. Michael published several novels, wrote articles and political columns, actively criticized local authorities, and quickly became a well-known figure in Durham. He adored attention. People recalled that Michael always wanted to appear to be the smartest person in the room. He had a knack for projecting the impression of being intelligent, educated, and successful. At parties, he easily became the center of attention, telling stories, debating politics, and acting as if he were in complete control of any situation. It was then that a woman named Patricia appeared at his side. Michael and Patricia married and began building a family. They had 2 sons, Todd and Clayton. From the outside, their life seemed like a near-perfect American story. A large house, a successful father, children, family friends, constant visitors, and a sense of stability. But later, 2 more girls would appear in this story. While living in Germany, the Peterson family became friends with another American family, the Rutledges. They had 2 daughters, Martha and Margaret. The girls' parents were considered very close friends of Michael and Patricia. First, the girl's father died. Sometime later, a tragedy occurred that would later become one of the most horrific coincidences in the history of this case. In 1985, the girl's mother, Elizabeth Rutledge, was found dead at the foot of the stairs in her home in Germany. It was Michael Peterson who discovered the body. At the time, the death was attributed to a stroke. The investigation concluded that Elizabeth had lost consciousness and fallen down the stairs. The case was quickly closed, and no one particularly doubted the accidental nature of the case. But years later, people will ask a chilling question: how did 2 women closely associated with Michael Peterson die in almost identical ways. After Elizabeth Ratcliffe's death, her daughters were effectively left without parents, and so Michael and Patricia decided to take the girls in. Martha and Margaret began living with the Peterson family and grew up alongside Todd and Clayton. From the outside, this seemed noble, even heroic. Many believed Michael had acted with genuine humanity by taking responsibility for his friends' children, and this is precisely what would later make the whole story so confusing, because so many people truly loved Michael. He didn't come across as a dangerous man. On the contrary, he was an intelligent writer, a caring father, a man with good manners, and a large circle of friends. But over time, his first family began to crumble. His relationship with Patricia deteriorated, and they later divorced. However, even after divorce, Michael continued to maintain the image of a man always surrounded by family, children, and people willing to trust him. And then, Kathleen Peterson came into his life, and it is with her that the most terrifying part of the story begins. After his divorce from Patricia, Michael Peterson's life didn't fall apart. On the contrary, it seemed like he was entering a new, even more successful phase. Kathleen was the complete opposite of the broken image. She was intelligent, energetic, successful, and highly disciplined. She worked for Nortel, a major telecommunications company, and earned a huge amount of money at the time. Many acquaintances recalled that it was Kathleen who essentially supported the family's lavish lifestyle. They lived in a large house in Durham. They threw parties and entertained guests. The house was constantly full of people and children. From the outside, their relationship appeared strong and happy. Many friends later said that Michael and Kathleen seemed like one of the most stable couples in their circle. But behind this beautiful image, problems gradually began to emerge. By the early 2000s, the family's financial situation had begun to deteriorate. Nortel was struggling, its stock was falling, and the family's expenses remained enormous. The house was becoming increasingly expensive. Michael was no longer the successful writer he once was. And although he continued to appear confident on the outside, internally the situation was becoming strained. But the main problem wasn't money. Michael had a secret life, which Kathleen, according to the prosecution, either knew nothing about or didn't understand its scope. Later, investigators would discover a huge number of messages with men, along with photographs and sexually explicit messages on his computer. It would emerge that Michael had met men online and sometimes met them secretly. Most importantly, many of these men said Michael didn't want Kathleen to know. It was then that the investigation would begin to build a theory. Perhaps Kathleen accidentally learned of her husband's double life that night, and this led to disaster. On the evening of December 9, 2001, Michael and Kathleen were alone at home. Michael would later tell police that they were sitting by the pool, drinking wine and talking. He claimed that Kathleen later went inside while he remained outside. Some time later, he allegedly entered the house and saw a horrific scene. Kathleen was lying by the stairs in a pool of blood. During the 911 call, Michael sounded both frightened and strangely in control. He repeated that his wife was still breathing. Then he said she was no longer breathing.
911, where's your emergency?
Peter Street, please.
What's wrong?
My wife had an accident. She's still breathing.
What kind of accident?
She's down the stairs. She's still breathing. Please come.
At one point, the dispatcher asked him to help her and stay by her side, but some would later note that his voice lacked the genuine panic of a man who had just witnessed the death of his beloved. When the police entered, the situation looked horrific. There was too much blood. Investigators immediately began to wonder, could a simple fall down the stairs have led to such a brutal scene? Deep wounds were found on Kathleen's head. However, she did not have the typical skull fractures often associated with a severe fall. This only heightened suspicion. Very quickly, the house ceased to be the scene of an accident, became the scene of a suspected murder. During the investigation, one of the investigators stumbled upon information that literally changed the entire case. It turned out that many years earlier, another woman closely associated with Michael Peterson had died near the stairs. This was Elizabeth Rutledge. When investigators dug up old materials, the coincidence seemed too strange to ignore. Two women, both closely associated with Michael, both found dead near the stairs. This came as a huge shock to the police. They decided to exhume Elizabeth's body many years after the funeral. A new medical examiner declared that the death no longer appeared natural. According to this new theory, the injuries could have been inflicted before the fall. Now the investigation was certain. History had repeated itself. It was at this point that the case against Michael began rapidly turning into a national sensation. The Michael Peterson trial quickly became one of the most talked about in the country. The prosecution painted a picture of a secretive manipulator who lived a double life and murdered his wife after she was exposed to his secrets. Prosecutors constantly emphasized Michael's secret correspondence with men. For the early 2000s, this made a powerful impression on jurors, especially because the prosecution claimed Kathleen had no knowledge of her husband's sex life. Michael himself denied this. He claimed Kathleen knew of his bisexuality and that he hadn't destroyed their marriage, but no one could verify this. The photographs of the death scene were particularly striking. The sheer volume of blood shocked the jury. The prosecution claimed Kathleen had been beaten and then left to die. The defense, on the other hand, argued that she had suffered a tragic fall and that the blood could have been caused by the long period of time she lay unaided. America was literally divided. Some were convinced Michael was a cold-blooded killer. Others believed the police were simply obsessed with the strange coincidence of the stairs and were trying to turn an accident into a murder at any cost. In 2003, a jury found Michael Peterson guilty of Kathleen's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, the family was completely destroyed. The strangest thing was that the children were separated. Some continued to believe in Michael's innocence even after everything they heard in court. Martha and Margaret Rutledge were especially ardent in his defense. They argued that the man who raised them after their parents' deaths was incapable of murder. Others began to doubt, and that's precisely what made the scene even more terrifying, because even people who had lived with Michael for decades no longer understood who he really was. It seemed the story was over, but years later, the case suddenly began to crumble. It emerged that one of the prosecution's key experts, a plot specialist, may have given false or exaggerated testimony in other cases. His work caused a huge scandal. This called into question some of the evidence against Michael. As a result, years later he was allowed to leave prison and seek a new trial. But instead of a new, full-fledged trial, something strange happened. Michael entered into what's known as an effort plea, a special legal agreement in the United States in which a person formally acknowledges that there is sufficient evidence against them to justify a conviction, but continues to maintain their innocence. He was eventually released, and this is precisely what angered so many people, because the case never answered the main question. Over time, some almost wild theories began to emerge around the case. One of the most famous is the owl theory. Some of Michael's defense attorneys have suggested that Kathleen may have been outside when an owl attacked her. According to this theory, the bird left wounds on her head. Kathleen panicked and ran into the house, lost her balance, and fell down the stairs. It sounds incredible, but the strange thing is that some experts actually found details that, according to the defense, could be consistent with this theory. And that's why the Michael Peterson case is still considered one of the most mysterious criminal trials in American history. Because decades later, people still debate, was it an accident, or was there someone with Kathleen that night who had already seen a woman dead by the stairs?